morning. Glad you're here. It's good to see you. If you have your Bible, open it to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. If you don't have a Bible, feel free to slip up your hand and we'll put a Bible in your hand. If you don't have a Bible at home, keep that one. It's a good book to read. Also, if you didn't get a sheet for notes, it's got those key announcements that Dave mentioned. You can get that with a hand in the air down at the bottom. Connection card. If you have prayer requests or praises or anything else you'd like to talk to us as a leadership team about, feel free to fill out that card, detach it, and drop it in the offering plate as it goes by after the sermon. So, as Dave mentioned, we've been reading Hebrews 11 together. And Hebrews 11 is the great chapter in the Bible about faith, and particularly the people who have embodied and illustrated and shown us the way of faith so that we might imitate them. And so we've heard about Abel, who trusted God. We heard about Enoch, who walked with God. We heard about Noah, who floated with God. We heard about Abraham and Sarah last week, who trusted God to bring the miraculous birth of their son Isaac out of their barrenness. And they left everything to go to the land where God called them and showed them. And God promised that he would multiply them, make them great, make them a great nation, and that they would be a family of blessing for all families of the earth. And so as you're reading through the beginning of Hebrews chapter 11, and you hear these stories of the faithful, it's inspiring. But just as the momentum of inspiration rises in our hearts, we arrive at verse 13, and we come across a very disturbing truth that all of these people share in common. And the truth, this troubling truth, is this. Hebrews 11, verse 13. All of these people died in faith without receiving the promises. They died in faith without receiving the promises. Now, can you imagine the debrief of this phrase, this sentence, between the writer of Hebrews and an everyday American person? The American person might ask the writer of Hebrews, pardon me, so did you just say they all died? Yes, that's right. They all died without receiving the promises. So let me get this straight. This is talking about Abraham and Sarah. God tells Abraham and Sarah to go to this place and that he's going to give them all this land and that he's going to turn this little family into a great nation. They believed God. They staked everything, their entire lives, on trusting this mysterious creator God, and then they died with nothing to show for it? And the writer of Hebrews replies, no, not exactly. I mean, they did have one son, miraculously, and when Sarah died, Abraham bought a cave from some Hittites. So you're saying a cave and a son. That's what they came out of this with. A cave and a son. After all these promises, a cave and a son. Is that troubling to you? All these people died in faith without seeing the promises? I mean, if you were a marketer trying to sell faith, this would not be your campaign slogan, would it? No. And this is not even how most of us think about life, waiting on promises, maybe even dying before promises are fulfilled. That would be such a letdown. This week, our mailbox, we had a brick mailbox, and Amy and I were sitting Sunday afternoon. The girls were asleep, so we had our 20 minutes of repose. And all of a sudden, it sounded like a truck just crashed into our front door. But actually, it was just a truck hitting our brick mailbox. And we went out, and sure enough, this whole structure is just decimated on the ground. And for the rest of the week, we picked up all the pieces. We just had a stack of cinder blocks with this little plastic mailbox sitting on top, like kind of a little plastic tub. I had to tell the mailman, just put our mail in there, please, for right now, and we'll get something better. But we ordered a mailbox online to replace our destroyed mailbox. And you ever track your shipments? You know, this new thing, last few years, not new thing. It's not like brand new. It's like there's been tracking of shipments for a while. But I can't resist it, right? When you do an order online and then they send you the tracking number, like I click on it and it's like still in facility. You're like, okay, whatever. And then you can see the next day it's like being moved from facility. You're like, yes, it's on the move. And you keep following this thing. And I thought about it. You know, these tracking numbers, they're like promises from the mail delivery company to us. And then the day of the delivery, sometimes you'll get this cryptic little message, delivery expected before 8 p.m. And you're like, okay, great. That narrows it down, I guess, roughly to the daylight hours. And then all day you're kind of waiting, And then it gets to 8 p.m. And you're thinking, okay, it's fine. Maybe it's a different time zone on the tracking number. And then it's 8:30. You're like, how late are these drivers out here delivering things? You get to 9 o'clock. I mean, I begin to despair if it's 9 o'clock. And here's what I realized. You know, if a tracking number is kind of like a promise, and we're trusting that the delivery will occur according to the tracking number's promise, I can barely go to bed in faith, trusting that this package will be delivered when it says it will be delivered. And yet here in Hebrews 11, it says these heroes of the faith actually died trusting God. What remarkable faith characterized their lives. How amazing is it that even though God had made all these spectacular promises and they did not experience the fulfillment of those promises in their own lifetimes, how amazing is it that they did not die in bitterness? How amazing is it that they did not die in uncertainty? How amazing is it that they did not die in disappointment? They died in faith. What a powerful statement, that their trust in God didn't have a timeline, that their ultimate confidence didn't come with an ultimatum for God to fulfill something. And I was talking to Dave Rhodes about this passage because he has preached from it before, and he was sharing with me some of his own notes, and of course they're like super catchy and inspiring, and he's kind of walking me through this, and he's like, yeah, at a certain point, these people who had faith, they didn't just have faith, their faith had them. And I was like, ooh, that's a great Dave quip, you know? And I felt something kind of tingle in my spine. I was like, yeah, maybe I could preach that. And then I was thinking about it, I was like, what does that mean though? And that's been my question all week. What does it mean to not just to have faith, but to come to this place in your life where your faith has you, or it becomes this defining characteristic of who you are? And here's what we find as we read the following verses. The pattern of Abraham and Sarah's life and these other heroes of the faith included them saying yes to some things, saying no to other things, and that these yeses and these nos shaped the very desire of their heart in powerful ways that made this verse, having died in faith without receiving the promises, it makes sense once you understand their hearts. So how do we get there? How do we live with that kind of faith? It says, even though they died without seeing the promises, they died in faith without receiving the promises. They saw the promises from a distance and they welcomed them. And one commentator says the picture in the language here is similar to the idea of sailors headed toward their home port. And they've been out for a while, and as they're sailing toward their home port, they're at the rail at the ship looking for land, looking for the sighting of the coast that means the harbor is near. And so the idea here is that even though Abraham and Sarah didn't actually arrive in that home port, so to speak, during their earthly lives, they could see it from a distance. And they saw it and they welcomed it, and it inspired them. They said yes to these promises of God, and they kept looking for those promises of God in their lives. They walked through that land. Maybe even there were days when they imagined this promised land being populated by their descendants. You know, the grandkids could plant some olive trees over there, and we could do a little citrus orchard over here. That'd be awesome. You know, maybe there's some of these moments where they're just like imagining into the promises that God has made them, even though they're not living it in the moment. And some people might criticize an Abraham and a Sarah for having blind faith. They're just kind of moving forward. But this verse says their faith wasn't blind. It was actually farsighted. They could actually see beyond. And they could hear that promise of God and value it and cherish it. And I wonder, like even in our own lives, do we have this kind of posture toward the promises of God? Do we, even when we're not seeing his promises fulfilled in our lives, do we continue to stand at the railing, so to speak, and look out at the horizon and catch a glimpse of that shoreline? And even though we're not there yet, we continue to say, yes, that is our home. And this yes of Abraham and Sarah to the promises of God is joined to a no. They didn't just see the promises from a distance and welcome them. They also confessed that they were strangers and immigrants on earth. That's the end of verse 13. And that word, confess, in the Bible, it's a strong word. It means simply to say what is true or to say what God already knows. So like when we talk about confessing sin, for example, we're not saying I'm sorry. We're saying I sinned. That's what confession is. It's simply admitting that thing that happened, that was not God's way. That was outside of his plan. That thing I did, that was against God's will. And so in confessing, we're simply admitting, we're saying what is true. And here, the scripture says that Abraham and Sarah confessed they were strangers and immigrants. Other translations of those words, foreigners, aliens, outsiders, sojourners, wayfarers. It means that they understood they were never truly at home in this broken and messed up world. I don't know if you've ever traveled in another country or even moved and lived in another country, or maybe you were born and raised in another country and you came to the United States, but there's something about living in a country not your own where you just kind of know you're not at home. So the summer after my junior year of college, I got this internship to go write for a magazine in Costa Rica, and it was a sweet internship, really, really cool. Lived with a host family, felt like I was living this amazing adventurer's life living in Costa Rica. But that whole summer, I was aware I was not at home, and there was this little place we would go for lunch, and it was like a local restaurant, and it was only me and a couple of the other interns were the only gringos who went to this place. And everybody else was just local. And the menu was basically just a plato del dia, the plate of the day. So whatever they were cooking that day, that's what you could order. It really simplified the options. If you have menu anxiety, this is the kind of place for you. And so you would show up, and they would always have the same basic things: beans, rice, some, plantains, and then there'd be a meat, and that would be the variety. And so we would go and we would get our lunch. And I walk up this one day and I see on the chalkboard, plato del dia, mondongo. And I couldn't remember what mondongo meant. And the other guys with me were like, what is that? But in the back of my mind, I had a very positive feeling about it. I was like, I think it's some kind of seafood, like an exotic Pacific sea bass or something. I think this is good. Everybody's like, okay, great, that's awesome. So we go through the line, we get our beans, we get our rice, we get our plantains, and then we get this ladle of mondongo over top. And it's these squares of kind of translucent pale flesh and sort of a clear gravy. And we sit down, and I'm looking at this thinking, this is not exotic sea bass. And it's got kind of like some lumps and lobes on it. And I'm just kind of staring at it. And all the other guys are staring at me. You know, they're not staring at their food. They're looking at me like, what has your translation done to my lunch? And so I just take my fork and I stick it in there and I start eating it. And it was horrible. It was disgusting. And it turns out it was boiled cow's stomach lining. And you could just taste that this flesh had digested something before. You know, you could just sense that was happening. Fortunately, it's like a $2 lunch, so my mistake didn't cost us too much. I remember I got home that evening, I was talking to one of my Costa Rican friends, and I told him about mondongo, and he was like, "You ordered that?" I was like, "Yeah." He goes, "Even in English, you know you should not order that. It's man, don't go. That's what mondongo sounds like." And so as much fun as it was to live in Costa Rica, there were just countless little things like that were reminders. You're not at home here. You don't know what mondongo is. Don't order it next time. And you can learn and you can get accustomed to it, but you're just always aware, I'm not quite at home here. That's what it means to be a pilgrim, a sojourner, wayfarer, immigrant, foreigner, stranger, like it says here. And so for Abraham and Sarah, they intentionally understood and said no. They confessed, this world, this life, we are pilgrims. We are moving. And the thing that defines a sojourner, a pilgrim, an immigrant, is that they're on the move. Abraham and Sarah understood that they were not settled in, but they were on a journey, and their journey was toward God and his promises. And this is crucial to understanding how they cultivated their faith into this thing that defined them as the mother and father of faith. And it says there in verse 14, people who say this kind of thing make it clear that they are looking for a homeland. And that word homeland in the original language is literally like the father's land. And the idea here is that Abraham and Sarah, even as they wandered through this promised land, knew that their true home was in the presence of God, in the father's land. And that language of longing is amazing. It says they're looking for a homeland, and I think that language just misses the point a little bit, because in the original, it's this sense of longing and desire in our will. And then a little bit later, we see that they are longing for a better country. And this language of longing, this language of desire, begins to work its way into a conversation about faith. What's that about? I mean, some of us might think that faith is something that mainly happens in our head. And yet here it's talking about how the faith of Abraham and Sarah responding to God's revelation is impacting the deepest desires of their heart. And this is huge. Jesus in his ministry spoke so many times about the heart, that out of the overflow of a heart, a man speaks, about the hardness of heart that closes off to God. What's going on in your heart, that place of desire, longing, and will? There's a Christian philosopher, he's alive today. He's not like one of these old guys sometimes we quote, but his name's James K.A. Smith. And he talks about, if you really want to get to know a person, what makes them tick, what's going on, don't ask them, what do you know? Because people have all sorts of stuff in their brains that they know. It doesn't really affect who they are. He says, don't even ask them, what do you believe? Because there are lots of things we could say we believe, but they don't really affect us. He said, the most important question, the most revealing question we could ask, what do you want? What do you long for? What do you love? And I was thinking about this. I don't know if you've flown in the last few years, but pretty much every airport now has the X-ray scanner in its security line. And so you get into this big machine and you put your feet on the little feet illustration. You hold up your hands like this, and there's this machine that goes in front of you and it like scans you, and then you walk out and the little person, the attendant at the, not a little person, it's just the person. I don't know why I used the diminutive there. I've had very, very tall security officers at the airport. Some are shorter, all shapes actually. And so you walk out. Oh, goodness. So you walk out, and you know how it is. There's this little screen. You can't really see the screen, but you have to stand there and wait until the person waves you through, or maybe the scanner has picked up like a gum wrapper in your pocket, and then they have to frisk your whole leg, you know. And so I just wonder what would happen if there was a scanner like that, and instead of scanning for weapons or gum wrappers, you stand in it and it goes like that, and it actually could bring up on the screen the truest desire of your heart. And just imagine you're standing there, and this desire pops up on the screen, and you can't see it. Would you want to? Would you want to know the truest, deepest longing of your heart? I mean, I would hope if I went through that scanner, and I came out here and I peeked around to look at the screen, it would say, God, the heavenly country. But I would also be afraid to look, because it might very well be the case that I sort of walk out and look and I see me. Or I walk out and I look at that screen and money. Or I step out and I look at that status, what other people think of you. Have you ever had that sense of disconnect between what you want to want and what you really want? Have you ever had that disconnect between what you know you should want and what you actually want? Maybe some of you'd be surprised. Maybe it's so deep and so subconscious that all these layers up on top is like, oh yeah, totally, I know exactly what I want. And then you look at the screen and you go, ooh, I don't think, there must have been some kind of machine malfunction. Here's what happened with Abraham and Sarah. They stepped on that scanner and they stepped out. Hebrews 11 tells us they longed for God. The desire of their hearts was the heavenly country, the homeland. That somehow in the process of their lives, they got this revelation from God, they received it in faith, and then the habits of their lives resulted in a more and more profound desire and love for God, the one who makes these promises. This is so interesting because when you get to verse 15, it says, if they had been thinking about the country that they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return to it. So it's clear that they are journeying through looking for a homeland, that their desire is for God. But then there's this weird little verse in 15. It says if they were thinking about the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return to it. And the idea there of thinking about, if they've been thinking about the country, is habitually remembering the country that they had left. So, I mean, you could just picture it, right? Abraham and Sarah are journeying through the promised land. How easy it would have been to just get into this conversation like, back in Mesopotamia, it was pretty awesome. Yeah, it really was. The springtime was mild. The summer was not too hot. We had family there to watch the kids. Well, we don't have kids. Yeah, that's true, but still, they would have been there. They could have habitually remembered the land that they left. And the verse is telling us that if they had done that, they would have had opportunity to return. That the way that they practiced their faith, if it had been looking backward, if it had been full of regret about what they'd left behind, it would have shaped the desire of their hearts away from that Godward direction. Do you see that? The idea here is that our deepest affection and desire, the stuff we really love, it's not set in stone, it's shaped. It's shaped by the rhythms and the routines, the remembrances, the people that we're with. All of this impacts what we truly love. All of this, our activity, impacts what shows up on that scanner screen when we come to look at it. I don't know if you've ever remembered what you've left behind with longing. Have you ever spent time habitually meditating on the country you had left? I know for me sometimes when I'm having an existential crisis, usually it's close to my birthday in the year, I'll think back to when I was a high schooler and I had this offer of a scholarship to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I couldn't play baseball there, but it was still a pretty sweet scholarship. And I'll just start thinking about what would have happened if I had gone to Chapel Hill instead of Furman. You know, that was like one of the big questions. And if I spend too much time habitually remembering and imagining what my life would have been like, it's not healthy for me. And it begins to affect the affections of my heart. Or maybe you're on Facebook, you know, and you're just kind of like poking around and not really sure, and you're like, maybe I should just check in on one of my exes. See how they're doing. See how their page looks. Oh, they still look good. Interesting. Oh, look at that. You know what I mean? You start thinking about the land that you've left behind. Or you're thinking about your job, you know, and you're like, why did I pick this career path? And then you get to the reunion and it's like everybody makes more money than you, and you start thinking. And here's what happens when your life begins to take on those patterns and practices and routines, it begins to shape the affection of your heart. So what is it that you really love? And there can be a massive disconnect between what you say you really love and what you actually love. I'll give you some examples of this. Very few people start off thinking like, oh, I want to be a materialist. I believe stuff can make me happy. And so I'm going to do everything I can to get as much stuff as possible so I can maximize my happiness. Not a whole lot of people, especially in church. Now, there are some people who will unabashedly say, I'm totally a materialist. But in this community, you know, we're all kind of saying, no, we believe in God. Yeah, we know stuff doesn't really make you happy, mostly. And so here's the thing. And nobody really says, I want to be a materialist. But what if the routines and the practices and the habits and rhythms of your life are totally oriented toward getting stuff? You're just constantly buying, and you get into this place where you really only feel happy when you have new things. And all the people around you are affirming that. Hey, you do you. You are the most important in your life. You need to make sure you are taking care of yourself. And all of this messaging, everything. So all of that, the people, the practices, the rhythms, routines of your life are oriented toward buying and getting and accumulating. Here's what happens. You come out of that scanner, you look at the screen, it says materialist. Doesn't matter what you say you are. Here's what you really are, because the practices, patterns, routines of your life have shaped that deep affection in you. Very few people start off thinking, I want to be very self-centered. I want to be the most self-centered, me-focused egotist around. I mean, nobody really thinks that. But when you get into your life, and you engage in certain self-centered practices. Even our cell phones these days, they create this sort of world that we can enter into solo and decide who we want to see, who we don't want to see, who we want to talk to, who we don't want to talk to. Any question I have can be immediately answered. Everything I want to buy I can have right now if I just put it on my credit card and all this stuff. I mean, just our whole lives can become conformed in our practices to ourselves. And you step into that scanner and you step out and you look at the screen, me. Doesn't matter what you say you love. if your practices and your rhythms and your routines cultivate different affections, that's what you will truly love. And so here's the pattern we see with Abraham and Sarah, these great figures of faith. It begins with God, who in his grace abundantly gives them beautiful promises to live into. God gives them promises. But then Abraham and Sarah take those promises, and even though their journey is sometimes up and sometimes down, and even though there are seasons where Abraham is trying to save his own skin and Sarah is trying to scheme around these promises of God to get it shortcut and faster, even though the overall commentary on their lives is that those promises from God become the practices of their life. That they see and welcome those promises from before. They confess, they say, no, this is not our home. We are people of pilgrimage, moving toward God. And out of those practices emerges a sincere passion, longing, desire for God, for the homeland, for the heavenly country, as it says here in the scripture. Verse 16, at this point in time, they are longing for a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. He has prepared a city for them. So maybe just take a quick inventory of your life. Do you know the promises of God? Has God spoken into your life? Have those promises translated into practices? James Smith, the philosopher I mentioned, he talks about these practices, these rhythms and routines, and he uses the word liturgies. And liturgy is kind of a churchy word, and technically it means the order of worship, how you go about worship, like in a church gathering like this. You know, the order of our worship, we sing some songs, and Dave is the pastor of announcements, and then I preach a sermon. I'm just kidding, Dave's not a pastor of announcements, inside joke between us. But, somebody does the announcements, we have communion, worship response, a benediction and prayer at the end. You know, this sort of order of worship, that's a liturgy. And so the idea, according to this Christian philosopher Smith, is that we have these liturgies of life that cultivate our affections. And so for some of us, the routines and rhythms, the liturgies of our life cultivate ungodly affections, that the order of our lives moves us in the direction of worshiping the wrong stuff, like money and materialism or ourselves or some human relationship above God. And that these sort of unhealthy liturgies of life will lead us into idolatry that consumes us. But when the promises of the living God shape our practices, our liturgies of life, it results in a true affection and relationship with the living God. And this living God does not consume us, devour us, destroy us, and spit us out, but rather gives himself for us, that his love toward us is so much greater even than our affection toward him. And of course, the great story of God coming in Christ, giving himself for us and being resurrected is the reminder that when we give ourselves over in affection to God, we find ourselves in his love given back to us. And it becomes now more about the one who gives the promise than the promises themselves. It becomes more about the giver of these gifts than the gifts themselves, that we find ourselves in this place now where we don't just have faith, but faith has us. We're caught up in that sincere affection. This is why gathering, like we're doing this morning, is so powerful and so important in forming and shaping the affection and direction and desire of our hearts. We come together to rehearse and remember the promises of God. Our practices in this place are to bless God through song, to open our hearts to his word, to remember not just on our own, but corporately that we are pilgrims passing through and that we are going to stand at the rail and welcome that better country. We're going to look for that shoreline. We're going to remember that there's a better thing promised by God. That's what's so powerful in this congregational gathering. And one of the things that grieves my heart is that I find a number of people, even my age and younger especially, who look at life and say, yeah, I'm into God, and yes, I care about spiritual things. I even love Jesus, but I don't need church. I don't need to be in church. I don't need that weekly thing. Well, we can figure it out. Okay, great, but what practices, rhythms, routines, and people are in your life then cultivating and helping redirect that affection of your heart toward God? This is why the Old Testament is so full of rhythms and routines and patterns and people that help cultivate the affection of the heart toward God. A Sabbath every week. These feasts and festivals, these regular practices interacting with his word. This is what shapes our passions. This is what shapes our desires. And this is good news, particularly if your passions are for the wrong stuff. God can reform them. He can reshape them. He can redirect them. If you find yourself in a marriage that has fizzled, you feel no affection there, no desire, good news. God can renew the desire. God can refresh and even resurrect real affection. Soulmates aren't met, they're made. Now, what are we as a people? What are you? How are we living from promise to practice to passion? Abraham and Sarah, they lived it all the way into their death and beyond. And the result, the end of verse 16, God is not ashamed to be called their God. He has prepared a city for them. This delights God. It's like God looks and says, these people, they get it. They love me. That their hearts are turned in my direction, and so they will find life. So maybe the question we could wrestle with this morning is, what are you longing for? Do you long for the better country? Like when you see the news and there's a hurricane decimating the eastern seaboard, do you see that? And you grieve for that, but then there's a longing for a better country where disasters are no longer natural, where God's promises are fully fulfilled in a redeemed heaven and a redeemed earth. Or when you see conflict, we see relational disappointment and frustration. Do you get caught up in the anxiety of it? Or do you have that affection and passion to say, you know what, we're passing through this, but there's coming a day, there's coming a promise. I'm standing here at the edge of the boat looking toward the shoreline, and I know there's a time when God will set this right. You look at your own life, man, this thing's a wreck. I don't know what my affections are doing. They're in 10,000 directions. I can't even trust myself most of the time. Well, I don't want to look at what's on that screen. I don't want anybody else to look either because it'd be terrifying. Okay. How are we letting the renewing flow of God's promise, his word, his heart, begin to reshape our rhythms and routines, our liturgies of life, in order to reshape and renew and resurrect the affection for which we were made originally, and the only true affection that results in life flowing back into us in ways that we could not imagine or even know how to ask for. Lord, thank you for your word. And we ask that this kind of faith life that characterized Abraham and Sarah would also be true of us. Lord, I pray that you would lead us to be the kind of people whose truest desires are for you and for your kingdom. Lord, would you lead us to be the kind of people who seek first your kingdom and your righteousness in such a way that we can be confident you will add everything else in your perfect timing. And Lord, some of these places of our lives that are currently troubled and we're seeking the wrong stuff, desiring the wrong stuff, Lord, I just pray you would bring us back to you and teach us how to seek you in the midst of all these things, in the good times and in the hard times, in the successes and in the challenges. In your name we pray.